On a drugstore shelf in New Brunswick, New Jersey, sometime in the 1920s, there is a tin of Johnson's baby powder. The label is cream and gold. The name on it is written in a looping cursive that was copied, letter for letter, from a real man's signature. And above the name is the face of a baby, soft and clean and trusting. I have come back to that label more often than I can explain, because by the family's own account, the first baby ever used to sell that powder was not a stock drawing pulled from an artist's imagination. It was one of their own, a real Johnson child, the eldest daughter of the family that owned the company. Her face turned into the emblem of American innocence. She grew up to be a Broadway producer and a very rich woman, and, in a sworn legal proceeding decades later, an accuser of her own father, the man whose name is on the company, hired a Polish woman to cook and clean in his house, married her, and left her almost his entire $400 million fortune, cutting out all 6 of his children. The trial that followed was called the largest, the costliest, and the ugliest will contest in American history. The head of the company fired his own son from the top job and handed it to the first outsider to run the place since 1887. That son was dead of cancer within 5 years, at 50 years old, and his father had died of cancer not long before him. 2 of the founder's great-grandsons died 6 weeks apart, one of an overdose and one on a motorcycle. One of the daughters told a court that her own husband had tried to have her killed. A great-granddaughter and heiress was found dead at 30, alone, in a gated guest house in Los Angeles. A New Jersey court spent more than a decade deciding what the single word spouse meant in one family: trust. And the baby powder that made the name trusted is now at the center of a settlement worth about $8 billion, brought by people who say it gave them cancer. Every one of those things is in the public record, in court files and contemporary newspapers. None of them, on its own, is the strangest part. This is the story of how one New Jersey family turned sterile gauze and a baby's powder into the most trusted name in America. It is also the story of what that trust was hiding: a family that fired its own sons, fought in open court over a dead man's signature and a single word in a will, and has not run the company that carries its name in 60 years. I want to start with the label itself, because the label is the promise, and the promise is where the distance begins. Before we go further, one quick thing. If you subscribe, it helps build a community around these, and rewards the work that goes into them, and it costs you nothing. Chapter 1. The Label. There is a particular kind of trust we hand to a company without ever deciding to. We hand it to whoever made the thing we put on a newborn. Powder on the softest skin there is, in the most ordinary room in the house, by a parent who has not slept and is not reading the label closely. For most of the 20th century, in most of those rooms in America, the tin in that parent's hand said Johnson & Johnson. The powder came in 1894, 8 years after the company started. The name was already on it in that looping script, a cursive lifted directly from the signature of James Wood Johnson, one of the founding brothers, so that the brand itself was, quite literally, a family member's handwriting, and the face above the name was a baby, not a logo of a baby, soft and unworried, looking at whoever held the tin. By the standards of modern advertising, it was a simple idea, and a ruthless one. You do not sell powder. You sell the feeling a parent has looking down at a clean, sleeping child. And you attach your name to it so completely that the two cannot be separated. It worked for over 100 years. The powder, the baby shampoo, advertised on the promise that it would bring no more tears. The Band-Aid on the scraped knee. The bottle by the bath. The first aid box in the cupboard. The company became the quiet background of the American childhood, and then of the American medicine cabinet. The name you reached for without thinking when someone small was hurt. In survey after survey across the decades, when Americans were asked which companies they trusted most, this one sat at or near the top. year after year, decade after decade. Trust was not a side effect of the business. Trust was the business. I want to slow down on what they chose for the emblem, because it is easy to walk past, and it is the whole story in miniature. Of all the things a company could put on its product, this one chose the single most defenseless thing there is. A baby trusts whoever is holding it. That is not a marketing slogan. That is just what a baby is. And the company built a fortune on standing in for the person doing the holding, on being the name a parent trusts, the way an infant trusts an adult, without question and without the ability to check. And here is the detail that has kept me at this label for a long time. By the family's own tellings, and by the accounts of more than one writer who has spent years inside this family's papers and court files, the first baby used to sell the powder was a real Johnson child, the eldest daughter of the man who would inherit the company. Her face, or the idea of her face, turned into the picture of safety that sold the product into millions of homes. There is something almost unbearable in that arrangement once you know it. A company takes a real child, the family's own daughter, and turns her into the picture of perfect safety, and sells that picture into the nurseries of a nation. The child becomes shorthand for strangers, for everything tender and protected about early life. She did not stay a symbol. She grew up, and what she would eventually say, under oath and in print, about the family that made her the emblem of trust, is the kind of thing that makes you go back and look at the tin again and find that you cannot see it the same way. I will get to what she said. For now, it is enough to hold the two images side by side, the baby on the label and the woman who came from it, the promise printed on the tin and the family that printed it. That distance between the picture of safety a company sells and the private truth of the people selling it is the road this whole story walks down, and it begins on a clean gold label in a small New Jersey town. But that is a later chapter, and to understand how a family came to put its own child on a powder tin, you have to go back to a smaller and more wholesome story. 3 brothers, 1 town, and a genuinely good idea about keeping people from dying. Chapter 2, New Brunswick. The company began in 1886 in New Brunswick, New Jersey, with 3 brothers and a theory about germs that most American doctors did not yet believe. The brothers were Robert Wood Johnson, James Wood Johnson, and Edward Mead Johnson. The theory was Joseph Lister's, the British surgeon who argued that invisible organisms in the air and on the hands were what turned operations fatal, and that cleanliness was not a courtesy, but a matter of life and death. In an era when surgeons still operated in blood-stiffened coats they were proud of, this was close to heresy. Robert Wood Johnson had encountered Lister's ideas, by some accounts at a medical address tied to the Great Centennial Gathering in Philadelphia in 1876, and unlike most of the men in the room, he believed them. He saw, the way the people who build fortunes tend to see, that a belief could be a product. He brought in a New Brunswick pharmacist named Frederick Kilmer to run the science of it, a careful man whose son, Joyce Kilmer, would grow up to write one of the most recited poems in the English language. The company would be built on real method, not patent medicine bluff. The product was the sterile surgical dressing, gauze and bandages made clean, sealed, and ready to use, so that a doctor in a town with no laboratory could open a package and not introduce the very infection he was trying to prevent. The company incorporated the next year, in 1887, with 14 workers in a former wallpaper factory on the bank of the Raritan River. In 1888, it published a manual of antiseptic wound treatment and gave away tens of thousands of copies, teaching the method and selling the supplies to meet it. That same period brought the first commercial first aid kits. Built at first for railroad crews working far from any hospital, men who got hurt where no doctor could reach them. The third brother did not stay for all of it. Edward Mead Johnson left in 1898 to build his own company around digestive and infant nutrition products. the firm that became Mead Johnson, so that within a dozen years of the founding, the family had already produced its first split and its first rival. Then came the products that reached past the hospital and into the home. Baby powder in 1894. And at the start of the 1920s, the thing that put the family name into the medicine cabinet of nearly every house in the country. A cotton buyer at the company named Earl Dixon had a wife, Josephine, who cut and burned herself often in the kitchen. Dixon got tired of bandaging her by hand, so he laid out a strip of surgical tape, stuck small squares of gauze along it at intervals, and covered the whole thing so she could cut off a ready-made bandage and apply it one-handed. He showed it to the company, which put it on the market the following year, in 1921, under the name Band-Aid. By the standards of invention, it was almost nothing. A man solving a small domestic problem for the woman he loved. It became one of the most recognized products on Earth, and it made Earl Dixon a vice president. I find I stay on Earl Dixon longer than the story strictly needs, because the whole enterprise, at the start, was that. It was about harm and the prevention of harm, cleanliness against infection, a bandage against a small wound, a powder for a baby's comfort. The fortune was built, brick by brick, on the idea of protecting people from injury, especially the people too small or too hurt to protect themselves. That is a genuinely good thing to build a company on, and I do not want to be cynical about it, because the goodness of the original idea is exactly what makes the rest of it land the way it does. The company kept widening its reach. It made the sutures surgeons used to close a wound and the dressings they packed it with, the sanitary products that had been taboo to sell openly, the powders and creams and tapes that turned up in more and more American homes. By the early 20th century, to be injured in the United States, in a hospital or a kitchen or a schoolyard, was very often to be touched by something this one New Jersey company had made. The whole arc of it bent toward the body at its most vulnerable. The cut, the burn, the newborn, the patient on the table. The company grew into an institution, and institutions, at a certain size, need a particular kind of man to run them. The Johnson who took the company from a successful family business and turned it into an American monument was the founder's son, and he was, by every account that survives, a brilliant and exacting and very cold man. If you have made it this far, you should probably subscribe. It is free, and it is what keeps these coming. Chapter 3. The Credo. Robert Wood Johnson II was the kind of man who is easier to admire from a distance than to be related to up close. He was the founder's son, born in 1893, and he ran Johnson & Johnson from 1932. During the Second World War, he served in the Army and came out a brigadier general, and for the rest of his life, people called him the General, and he liked it. He was a genuine business visionary. He took the company public in 1944. He pushed for decentralized management, breaking the company into smaller operating units that could move on their own. He argued for treating workers well and paying them fairly before either was fashionable, and he wrote and spoke about the obligations of business to society at a time when most of his peers thought the only obligation was the dividend. When he took the company public in 1944, its annual sales were already around $95 million, and he was on his way to building one of the largest fortunes in the country. The decentralized structure he built, dozens of independent operating companies under one name, outlived him by generations and became a model that other corporations studied and copied. Whatever he was inside his family, in the building with his name on it, he was something close to a genius. In 1943, he wrote the document that the company still treats as something close to scripture. They call it our Credo. It is a short statement of who the company owes, and in what order, and the order is the remarkable part. Its first responsibility, it says, is to the patients, doctors, and mothers who use its products, then to its employees, then to the communities where it operates, and last, explicitly last, to its stockholders. A man who built one of the great American fortunes wrote down, as a permanent principle, that the shareholders came forth. It is a genuinely admirable document, and the company has leaned on it through real crises, including the Tylenol poisonings of the 1980s, when it pulled its product from shelves across the country and was praised for decades after for doing it. The credo is not a cynical thing. It meant what it said. He believed it enough to give most of his own fortune away to back it. When he died, the bulk of his estate, around $300 million in company stock, went to the foundation that still bears his name, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which grew into one of the largest charitable foundations in the United States and pours money into American health to this day. The public man was, by the measure of what he gave, genuinely generous. I keep setting that order of responsibilities next to the man's own family, because the contrast is hard to look away from. Patients first, employees second, community third, shareholders last. Nowhere in the most famous corporate creed in America, written by the most powerful man in this family, is there a line about a son, and the general, who could write so clearly about the company's duty to strangers, ran his own household and his own bloodline as a kind of proving ground, a place where you earned your standing and could lose it. He was demanding in a way that did not soften for family. He was exacting about detail, about loyalty, about performance, the sort of man who could make a room go quiet by entering it. The same instincts that built a great company, the insistence on standards, the refusal to be satisfied, ran straight through the front door of his own house and did not improve on contact with his children. The men in this family did not inherit their places. They auditioned for them, in front of a father who was very hard to satisfy, and the cost of that arrangement is the engine of everything that follows. It is a strange thing to build the most trusted family brand in the country, and to run your actual family like a company with one shareholder whose approval can be withdrawn. The general gave the world a document about putting people first, and gave his own children a standard most of them could not meet. Both of those are part of the same man, and the company kept only the first half of him on the wall. The general had a son he had been grooming his whole life to take the company. The son's name was Robert Wood Johnson III. He got the job, and then his father took it back from him in a way that the company spent years trying not to talk about. Chapter 4. The Son He Fired. In 1965, the president of Johnson & Johnson was removed from his job by the chairman of Johnson & Johnson, and the two men were father and son. The son was Robert Wood Johnson III, known in the family as Bobby. He was born in 1920, and almost from birth he was the designated heir, the boy who would one day run the company. He did the things an heir does. He worked his way up through the business, learning it from the inside the way his father demanded. He was elected mayor of Highland Park, New Jersey, while still in his 20s, a young man already wearing the family's public face. He married a woman named Betty Wold, and they had sons, and the line looked secure for another generation. And in 1961, his father made him president of the company, the fifth generation of the name to be groomed for the top, and for a moment the line of succession looked clean. It lasted 4 years. By 1965, the general had decided his son was not the man to run the company, and he did not arrange a graceful exit or a quiet reassignment. He removed him. He pushed his own son out of the presidency and handed the job to a company executive named Philip Hoffman, the first person from outside the family to run Johnson & Johnson since 1887. After almost 80 years, the family that built the company, and whose handwriting was the logo, no longer ran it, and the man who ended that streak was the general himself, by firing the son he had raised to continue it. Hoffman was a capable executive, and the company did well under him. That is not the point. The point is that the general looked at his own son in the chair he had spent a lifetime preparing him for, decided he was wrong for it, and chose a stranger over his own blood, in public, in the company that carried their shared name. There is a version of corporate history that treats this as sound governance, the founder putting the company above sentiment. Perhaps it was, but a man is allowed to wonder what it costs a son to be told, by his father and the world at once, that the one thing he was made for is being given to someone else. I have tried to find the softer version of this, and it is not really there. A father spent decades preparing a son for one job, gave it to him, and then took it away and gave it to a stranger. What that does to a man is not in the corporate record, but the next few years are. The general died first, of lung cancer, in January of 1968. Bobby died less than 3 years later, in December of 1970, of colorectal cancer. He was 50 years old. The father who fired him and the son he fired were both gone, both of cancer, inside the same short stretch of years. And whatever had been broken between them was never going to be repaired now, and the branch kept paying. Bobby left sons of his own with Betty, and in 1975, 2 of them died within weeks of each other. One of an overdose, one in a motorcycle accident. 2 young men, brothers, gone within the same short span, in a family that owned the company whose entire promise was the prevention of harm. Their mother, Betty, outlived them by decades. One of those women who become the keeper of a family's griefs, because she is the one left standing to remember them. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to turn this into a curse, and a curse is a way of not thinking. There is no curse. There is a great deal of money, a great deal of pressure, a father who measured his children against an impossible standard, and a series of human beings who did not survive it. The company kept making powder and bandages and baby shampoo for the nation's children, kept running the advertisements about safety and softness and a parent's love. Inside the family that owned it, the children were not faring as well. And the gap between those 2 facts is, in the end, the whole subject of this story. That was the general's branch, the side that ran the company. The larger fortune, and the strangest ending of all, was waiting on the other side of the family, with the general's brother. Hit subscribe if you want the next one. It costs nothing, and it takes a second. Chapter 5. 6. Trusts. On the 30th of October, 1944, John Seward Johnson Sr. signed 6 trusts, one for each of his 6 children, and in doing so set the terms for a war that would not be fought for another 40 years. Seward was the general's younger brother. Born in 1895, a longtime executive and director of the company, but never its head, he was richer than almost anyone realizes, because he held an enormous block of Johnson & Johnson stock from the earliest days. And that stock did what early stock in a great company does. It compounded into a fortune that no one in the family had to work to maintain. His first marriage, to a Bermudian woman named Ruth Dill, gave him 4 of his 6 children. Ruth came from a notable Bermuda family, and her sister was the actress Diana Dill, which made Seward's children first cousins of the actor Michael Douglas, a small thread that says something about how far this family reached. The marriage to Ruth ended, as several of the marriages in this story end, in money and recrimination. A later marriage to a woman named Esther Underwood, whom everyone called Essie, gave him the others and lasted more than 30 years. Seward was not the company man his brother was. He served as a director and an executive, but he was happier on the water than in a boardroom. And late in life he poured a great deal of his fortune into ocean science, founding a research institution on the Florida coast that he cared about more, by some accounts, than he cared about most of the people in his will. That detail matters later, because when the fight over his estate came, the Ocean Institute was one of the few beneficiaries almost nobody begrudged. The trusts he signed in 1944 were generous. And they were also, in the way of these things, a quiet machine. Each child got a trust funded with about 15,000 shares of the company, worth a few $100,000 at the time, and destined to grow into something vast. But the trusts carried a provision that mattered enormously later. If one of the 6 children died without children of their own, that child's share did not simply vanish or pass to a spouse. It was divided among the surviving siblings. The document, in other words, made the 6 of them into each other's heirs, whether they liked one another or not. I find that provision worth sitting with, because it is the kind of thing that looks like prudent estate planning and functions like a slow poison. You have written into law that your children are worth more to each other dead and childless than alive. You have given 6 siblings a permanent financial interest in one another's misfortune. Nobody in 1944 was thinking about it that way. They were thinking about taxes and continuity and keeping the stock in the family. But the wiring was in the wall now, and families feel that kind of wiring even when they cannot name it. A great deal of money sat at the center of these 6 lives, money none of them had earned, money that was theirs by birth and could be reshaped by a lawyer. And that is a difficult thing to grow up inside of with a clear head, by the standards of the very rich. Seward's children grew up about as gilded as American children could be. Trust income, grand houses, horses, boarding schools, summers that most Americans only read about, the company's name opening every door before they reached it. There were 6 of them. Mary Leah, the eldest, the baby from the label. Elaine, Seward Jr., who would become a sculptor. Diana, who would breed a Kentucky Derby horse. Jennifer, and James, the youngest, who painted. And by the standards of almost any family, they were a troubled and scattered group. 4 of them from one marriage and 2 from another, raised more by staff than by parents, circling a father who was warm in some tellings and remote in most. That father, in his 70s, was a widower in the making, restless inside a long marriage to Essie, rattling around a large house in Oldwick, New Jersey, with a staff to run it. And Essie, trying to manage that house, hired a young woman who had recently arrived from Poland to help with the cooking and the cleaning. Her name was Barbara Piasecka. She had been in the country for a matter of months. She had a degree in art history and almost no money. And within a few years, she would be the wife of the richest man in the family and the heir to nearly all of it. Chapter 6. Basia Barbara Piasecka arrived in the United States in 1968 with a degree in art history, a few words of English, and, by most accounts, somewhere between $100 and $200 to her name. She had been born in Poland in 1937, into a country that the war and then the Soviet system had stripped of nearly everything. She was clever and serious, and trained in the history of art, and like a great many educated Eastern Europeans of her generation, she found that the training was worth very little in the place she had been born. So she left. She came to New York, and she took the work that was available to a young immigrant woman with no money and no connections, which was domestic work. And the household that hired her was the household of Esther Underwood Johnson in Oldwick, New Jersey. She came in, depending on which account you read, as a cook or as a chambermaid. What is not in dispute is that she came in through the kitchen, as staff, to clean and to cook for the wife of John Seward Johnson Sr. And within a few years she had moved from the kitchen to the center of his life. Seward, who had collected art for decades and had the money to collect at the highest level, found in this young woman someone who actually knew the field, who had studied it formally, who could tell him what he was looking at and what it was worth and whether it was real. She could talk to him about the things he cared about in a way the people around him could not. She became, in effect, his curator, and then something more than that. The distance from the kitchen of the house to the chair beside the collector was, in the end, not very far at all. In 1971, he divorced Essie. 8 days later, he married Barbara. He was 76, She was 34. None of his 6 children came to the wedding. The marriage of their father to the woman who had been their stepmother's cook was not, in their eyes, an occasion. It is worth being careful with this chapter, more careful than the story is usually told, because there are 2 cheap versions of it, and the truth supports neither. The first cheap version is the fairy tale, the cook who won the prince. The second cheap version is the gold digger, the schemer who worked her way up through the bedroom to the will. The record does not cleanly support either one. What the record supports is a genuinely brilliant woman, with a real expertise that the old man valued, who married him, and who was, by the account of many people who knew them, a real companion to him for the dozen years they had. She did not come from nothing in the sense of being unremarkable. She came from nothing in the sense of having no money, which is a different thing, and the family's view of her never quite separated the two. It also supports the fact that she ended those years holding nearly everything, and that his 6 children ended them holding almost nothing. And both of those things can be true at once. What they built together was a house. Not a home exactly. A house called Jasna Polana, on 222 acres outside Princeton, designed by one of the most prominent architects in America. A structure so elaborate and so heavily revised by Basia that the architect reportedly asked to have his name taken off it. It had art and marble and gardens and a level of grandeur that even by the standards of the very rich was conspicuous. One writer who chronicled the family called it less a home than a vault with beds. It was designed by Wallace Harrison, an architect who had worked on Rockefeller Center and the United Nations, and Barbara revised his plans so heavily and so often that, by some accounts, he asked to be disassociated from the result. When it was finished in the late 1970s, the inaugural dinner was cooked by one of the most celebrated chefs in France. The estate ran to a reported $30 million in an era when that was a barely imaginable sum for a private house. It would later become a golf club. Its grand rooms turned into a clubhouse, its grounds into a course. Basia kept an apartment in it until almost the end of her life. After Seward died, she became, in her own right, one of the wealthiest women in the world, a fixture on the Forbes list of billionaires and a major patron of Polish art and Polish causes. And when she died in 2013, she was buried in the country she had left with almost nothing. Seward Johnson died in that orbit of wealth in the spring of 1983, and the document he left behind, signed about 40 days before his death, took the fortune that 6 children had spent their whole lives expecting, and handed almost all of it to the woman who had come in through the kitchen 15 years before. Subscribing is how stories like this keep reaching you. It is free, and it is the whole of the ask. Chapter 7. The largest, costliest, ugliest one of the writers who spent years inside this case described the contest that followed as the largest, the costliest, the ugliest, the most spectacular, and the most conspicuous will fight in American history. By the time it was over, it had earned the description. John Seward Johnson Sr. died on the 23rd of May, 1983, of prostate cancer, at the age of 87 in Florida. The will that governed his estate had been signed on the 14th of April, 1983, about 40 days before he died, by a man in the last stage of a terminal cancer. It left the great majority of a fortune of just over $402 million to Barbara. It left the 6 children, in practical terms, cut out. And it named as a key executor a lawyer named Nina Zagat, a young attorney who had drafted the will, who was close to Barbara, and who, with her husband, would later become famous for a series of restaurant guides that carry their name. If the will stood as written, Zagat stood to collect something on the order of $8 million in fees, and a trusteeship worth a great deal more over time. The 6 children sued. They argued that their father had been incompetent when he signed, weakened by age and cancer and medication, and that he had been under the undue influence of his wife and her lawyer. The case went to trial in February of 1986 in the Surrogates Court in Manhattan, before a surrogate judge named Marie Lambert, and it ran for roughly 15 weeks. It became, for a season, the best entertainment in New York. The newspapers covered it the way they covered the prime-time soap operas about scheming rich families, except that this one was real, and the family was the one whose name was on the baby powder. Reporters compared it openly to those television dynasties. The difference was that the wealth on the table was real, and the people testifying about who had struck whom and who had stopped thinking clearly were a real father's real widow and his real children. It was exactly the spectacle the family name should have made impossible. The children's side put on witnesses who described Barbara berating the old man, controlling him, even striking him. Barbara's side put on more than 40 witnesses who described a competent, affectionate husband who knew exactly what he was doing and had every reason to do it. Having watched his children live on money none of them had earned, both sides spent fortunes. Every private wound the family had was dragged into a public courtroom and entered into the record. That fact is the one that cuts hardest against the whole brand. This was the family whose name meant trust, whose logo was a baby, whose fortune was built on protecting the vulnerable. And when the patriarch died, his widow and his children sat in a public courtroom in Manhattan for 15 weeks and let strangers and reporters watch them try to destroy each other over $400 million. The credo said the family came after the customer. In that courtroom, it was hard to find evidence the family came anywhere at all. The company that had spent 100 years teaching the country to trust it could do nothing about the fact that its founding family was, for 15 weeks, the least trustworthy-looking group of people in New York, and that every word of it was on the record and in the papers. It never reached the jury. On the 3rd of June 1986, the day before the case would have gone to them, the two sides settled. The terms, as reported at the time and reconstructed since, left Barbara with the bulk of the estate, somewhere between $300 and $350 million, depending on how the trusts are counted. The 6 children divided roughly $42.5 million among them, on the order of $6 million each. $20 million went to the Ocean Research Institute Seward had founded on the Florida coast. The one beneficiary almost nobody in the room resented, because it was the one thing he had built that was not about the family at all. Each of the 6 children, by the most careful reconstruction of the settlement, came away with something just under $6 million, a fraction of what the original 1944 trusts would have grown to had they been left alone, and a rounding error against what their father had left his widow. And Nina Zagat, who had stood to collect around $8 million and a rich trusteeship if the will held, walked away with a fraction of it, something close to $1.8 million. The surrogate judge, Marie Lambert, had made little secret of her sympathy for the children, and by some accounts, she turned up at their celebration afterward. At the center of the 6 children who fought that war was the eldest, the one who had been the baby on the powder label, the one whose face had sold the idea of safety to the country, and whose own account of her childhood was the darkest thing the trial never quite had to examine. Chapter 8. The Baby on the Label. Go back to the tin on the drugstore shelf. The baby, the cursive name, the promise. The eldest of Seward Johnson's 6 children was Mary Leah Johnson, born in 1926, and she is the one the family has said was the first baby used to sell the powder. She grew up to say that the home behind that image was not what the label promised. The face the company used to mean safety belonged to a girl who would later describe a childhood that was anything but safe. In sworn statements and in interviews late in her life, and in the books written about the family, Mary Leah alleged that her father had sexually abused her over a period of years when she was young. I am going to state that the way the record states it, as her allegation, made by her, under oath and in print, because that is exactly what it is. Seward Johnson was never tried on it, never charged, never able to answer it in a court while he lived, and the family, for the most part, did not discuss it in public. The allegations surfaced in the open only after he was gone, in interviews and in the books that dug into the family, where it sits as one of the heaviest things any of them ever said. It is her account. But it is her account given formally, repeatedly, and at cost to herself. And it sits in the permanent record of this family next to the image of the baby on the powder. Her adult life had the shape of someone trying to get free of something. She married young, a man named William Ryan, and had 6 children with him, becoming, in the same years she was raising them, a woman with a great deal of money and a great deal she did not talk about. She later married a psychiatrist named Victor d'Arc. The marriage to Victor d'Arc ended in a divorce he filed in the mid-1970s. And it was in the wreckage of that marriage that the strangest chapter of her life unfolded. And that episode reads, even now, as almost too much. In the middle of the 1970s, as the marriage was collapsing, Mary Leah came to believe, and then alleged, that her husband was trying to have her killed. The matter was investigated. By the published accounts of the family, an informant who was said to hold tape recordings related to a plot against her was jailed for contempt after refusing to testify before a grand jury. Victor d'Arc was never indicted, but the divorce court that handled the end of the marriage took the murder plot evidence seriously enough to weigh it in its rulings, denying d'Arc the financial terms he sought. Precision matters here. No one was convicted of plotting to kill Mary Leah Johnson. What the public record holds is an allegation, an investigation, a jailed informant, and a divorce court that did not dismiss it. She survived all of it, and she built something. With her third husband, the Broadway producer Martin Richards, Mary Leah helped found a producing company called the Producer Circle, and she became a credited Broadway producer in her own right. Her best-known production was the musical Sweeney Todd, which won the Tony Award for Best Musical in 1979. The girl whose face had sold powder to the nation became, for a stretch of years, a real presence on the American stage, with her name above the title on serious work. And long after her death, in 2003, her widower Martin Richards would win the Academy Award for Best Picture as the producer of the film version of the musical Chicago, a project he had chased for decades. She did not live to see it. She had been gone 13 years by then. The girl on the powder tin became a woman who put her own money and name behind the American stage, and did it well. Here is the beat that does not let go. Of all the children in this family, the one chosen to be the public face of its innocence, the literal emblem of the safe and protected child, was the one who would grow up to make the gravest accusation of all about what went on inside the family. The company sold her face as the picture of trust. She spent a good part of her life telling the world that trust was the thing she had not been given. She lived her last years as a producer and a patron, married to Martin Richards, a long way from the powder tin and the house she had grown up in, though never entirely free of either. Mary Leah Johnson Richards died of liver cancer in 1990 at the age of 63. Having lived long enough to put her name on the public record about her own father, and long enough to build something of her own that had nothing to do with him. And even her death did not close the family's accounts, because of a single word in a document her father's brother had signed almost 30 years before. If you are still here this deep into it, you are exactly who these are made for. Subscribe, and they keep coming. Chapter 9. One word. In 1961, John Seward Johnson Sr. had signed another trust, separate from the 6 he set up for his children. And into that trust went a fortune that would grow to around $350 million. The trust used an ordinary word that nobody, in 1961, thought needed defining. The word was spouse. Decades later, that one word became the subject of one of the longest pieces of litigation the family ever produced. and that is saying something. When Mary Leah died, her widower, the Broadway producer Martin Richards, claimed that he was entitled to a share of the income from that trust as her surviving spouse. The trustees and other family interests disagreed. Their argument turned on a piece of grammar. Seward had written spouse, not surviving spouse. Did a person stop being a spouse the moment their husband or wife died? Or did the word reach past the grave to cover the one left behind? It sounds like the kind of thing that gets resolved in an afternoon. It took about 11 years, by the count of the legal press, and some accounts call it 12. A trial judge ruled first that the word was not ambiguous at all. An appeals court disagreed, found that it could be read more than one way, and sent the whole question back down. There was a full hearing into what Seward Johnson had probably intended when he wrote it. An attempt to read the mind of a man who had been dead for over a decade, on the meaning of a word he had almost certainly not thought twice about. And finally, on the 3rd of April, 2008, more than 24 years after Seward Johnson died, and more than 40 after he signed the trust, the New Jersey Supreme Court ruled in favor of Martin Richards. He did qualify as a spouse, and he was entitled to his share of a trust worth around $350 million. The lower courts had divided on the question before it ever reached the top bench. One judge reading the word one way and an appeals panel splitting over it, which tells you that a single common word really was as slippery as a full decade of the most expensive lawyers in the region had been paid to argue. The whole episode is clarifying, in a way, because it shows you the machine the family actually ran on. Most families, when someone dies, settle the estate in a matter of weeks, with one lawyer and a stack of forms. This family fielded the most expensive law firms in New York and New Jersey across decades, in surrogates court and trial court and appeals court and the state's highest bench, over a dead man's signature, over the children's competence claims, and finally over the definition of a single common word. The money did not just buy houses and art and horses. It bought a private justice system available to almost no one else, staffed by the kind of white-shoe law firms whose names sit on the doors of skyscrapers, the firms that defend banks and governments and the largest companies on earth, in which the meaning of the word spouse was worth more than a decade of the nation's most expensive legal time. The same firms that had defended the will and the company and the brand were now billing year after year to argue grammar. And the spouse case was not even the only one. There had been the 15-week trial over the will. There had been a separate fight over how the taxes on one of the old family trusts should be divided among more than 20 descendants, which went all the way to the state's highest court on its own. The Johnson estate did not so much pass from one generation to the next as grind its way through the courts for the better part of 40 years, a permanent feature of New Jersey and New York legal life, throwing off fees the way the company threw off dividends. Think about what that machine cost and what it was for. An ordinary family settles a death in a few weeks, with one lawyer and a stack of forms, and grieves in private. This family argued for decades over signatures and competence and grammar, and every round of it was public, and every round of it was paid for out of a fortune none of the litigants had earned. That machine protected the fortune across 4 decades and 2 states, and every level of court the system had. It could not protect the people. It could keep a trust intact and a definition litigated and a settlement sealed, but it could not keep a son from being fired, or a daughter from her childhood, or a grandchild alive. And the people, in the generation that came next, kept providing evidence of exactly that. Chapter 10. What the Label Promised. On the 4th of January 2010, an heiress of the Johnson family was found dead in a guest house in Los Angeles. Her name was Casey Johnson. She was 30 years old. She was the daughter of Robert Wood Johnson IV, known as Woody, who is the grandson of the general and the son of Bobby, the man his own father had fired. Casey had grown up with everything the name could provide, and had struggled for much of her short life. With her health, and with the particular weightlessness of being very rich and not required to do anything. She had lived in the gossip columns and the early reality television world, an heiress famous mostly for being one, and she had struggled with her health for years. She had diabetes. She died of a complication of it, a condition called diabetic ketoacidosis, alone, in a gated property at 30. She had recently taken in a child she meant to raise. The family that owned the company, built on caring for the small and the sick, had, again, been unable to keep one of its own from dying young. Another young person in this family gone early, 2 generations after Bobby's 2 sons died 6 weeks apart. Her father is the part of the family that is still, in the public sense, winning. Woody Johnson bought the New York Jets in 2000 for $635 million. He became a major political donor and, later, the United States ambassador to the United Kingdom. Around the turn of the century, he and his first wife, Sale, divorced in a settlement that was reported, though never confirmed in the figures, at around $100 million. His own wealth is hard to pin down. Forbes has put him in the range of $3.5 billion. Bloomberg, counting the Jets and his holdings differently, has put him closer to $10 billion. The gap between those two numbers is larger than most family fortunes. But here is the fact that sits under all of it, the negative finding that the whole story has been circling. No member of the Johnson family has run Johnson & Johnson since 1965, when the general fired his son. The family that built the company, whose handwriting is the logo, whose child was the baby on the label, holds today only a small fraction of the company that carries their name. The trust that was the brand, the family company, outlived family control by 60 years. And the product that carried the trust has become the thing the company is sued over. For more than a decade, tens of thousands of people have brought claims saying that the talc in Johnson's baby powder was contaminated with asbestos and caused cancer, mostly ovarian cancer and a rare cancer of the chest lining. The company has denied it, has insisted for years that its powder is safe, and has fought the claims on every front. It pulled the talc version of the powder from the North American market and switched to a cornstarch base. It tried, more than once, to push the liability into a small subsidiary and put that subsidiary into bankruptcy, a maneuver meant to settle the claims in one move and cap the payout at around $8 billion. Judges rejected that strategy more than once, the most recent rejection coming in the spring of 2025, which left the company facing the claims in the ordinary courts, with the fight still unresolved. The consumer products, including the powder itself, have been spun off into a separate company. The baby powder that made the name mean safety is now, in courtrooms across the country, the thing the name has to defend itself against. Let me step back from all of it, because the chronology is finished. It would be easy to call this a curse, a cursed family, doomed by its money. And I am not going to do that, because a curse is a way of refusing to look. There is no curse. There is a fortune, and the things a fortune does to the people born on top of it, and the distance between an image a company sells and the family that sells it. What strikes me, after the time I have spent with the wills and the trial transcripts and the obituaries, is how completely the public image held while the private reality came apart behind it. For 100 years, the country reached for that tin without a second thought, trusting the name the way a baby trusts the arms around it. And for most of that same century, the family behind the name was firing its sons, suing its widows, dragging its wounds through open court, and burying its young. Both things were true the whole time, on the same shelf, under the same word. What survived is the name, the logo, the foundation, the company, the powder still on the shelves of the world. What did not survive is harder to list. A son told he was not good enough for the job he was raised for, dead at 50. 2 brothers gone in one summer. A daughter who was the face of the brand, and spent her life accusing the family behind it. A young woman dead at 30 in a locked house. The family that built the most trusted name in America and could not extend that trust to its own. Go back, one last time, to the tin on the New Brunswick shelf in the 1920s. The cream and gold label, the looping cursive copied from a founder's own hand, the baby's face above the name, soft and clean and trusting, looking up at whoever is holding it. Nothing about the label has changed in 100 years. It still promises the same thing it always promised. The powder is still on the shelf, and the name is still on the building. What it promised and what it is now accused of are printed on the same label. This is what these are for. Subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.